Today on Joe Public Speaking, I'm talking with theologian Martin Rumscheidt. Martin has just released a new essay called Honoring Father and Mother, an Impossible Possibility, which will be featured in a soon-to-be-released collection of essays based on the Holocaust. And Martin has kindly sat for a couple of interviews prior to this when he's released a book or just to kind of talk with us about his childhood and growing up years in Germany during the Third Reich. And so today we're going to focus our conversation on this, the content of this latest essay. So welcome once again, Martin Rumscheidt.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm glad to be able to chat with you again.
Same here in these weird sorts of times, you know, albeit that this one is, this chat is over Zoom, of course, because of the pandemic that just doesn't seem to want to go away. But anyway, so I hope that you're in good health and safe.
Yes, I've had both vaccinations. Both Nancy, my spouse, and I have had them, and we are obeying the rules of social distancing and masks and gatherings with people, only a very small number. And so far, we have been really lucky, have not been infected. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that. So, as is often the case when I read your writing, I chose a number of quotes, but rather than starting to, you know, read those and ask you to comment on them, how about if we start out, you know, what inspired the writing in this essay called Honoring Father and Mother, an Impossible Possibility, with a question mark at the end, you know, we'll kind of go from there.
I've been asked in conversations with others, scholars and non-scholars, people in the church, other people without any kind of connection to a religious community. And their question is, what you know about your father, what does that do to you as a human being, knowing that your father was an accomplice, not only of your father, but others in your family, in the wider relationship? How is it possible to go on? And this has been a question that has been confronted by many people in my situation. And so as I go into this particular question, I do so also, number one, as a theologian, my profession. And also I'm doing this because I was part, or am part of a family that is, I would say, a pious, in a very positive sense of that word, a pious family. So that in my upbringing, the Ten Commandments were a significant factor. And so now I'm experiencing a kind of collision between this commandment, honor your father and mother, and knowing who my father and mother are. And that was the motivation to do this essay.
Well, throughout the essay, there are some very powerful quotes, and some of them are quotes from your, of course, past relations with family members, and direct quotes from them at the time, and others, of course, are just the various parts of the writing that you do within the essay. One of the things that came to mind for me as I was reading this, so I'll start with you know, one of the things when you were writing about, of course, you write about your parents throughout, particularly your father, and that's combined with some of the concepts that I think not only exist, you know, for those who have gone through um, what happened in Germany during that era, but also here in this country in some instances. And then there are just the sort of general, I don't know if we want to call them expressions or whatever, but there's always this expression of forgive and forget, or there's always situations where one culture, and I'm not downplaying it, but I'm just mentioning, there are situations where one culture says we can never forget this, we should never forget it, while maybe the perpetrator culture says that we just want to forget it, or maybe they don't even say anything, but it's obvious that they just want to forget it. And I think you kind of allude to that in reference to German society during that era.
Yes, yes. Picture, for example, right now, Tom, that Henry Louis Gates Jr. had invited me to be part of his program, Finding Your Roots. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about my roots, and I don't know very much. Maybe I can go back 3 generations. That's not the point, whether I can go back or not. But if I were on his program, I would have to deal with my relationship to my roots, to those who are before me, and whether this is a relationship that I can sustain, that I can rejoice in, or is this a threatening relationship, a dangerous relationship? Let me tell you about a film that was released in the 1980s by the Canadian Film Board, the National Film Board of Canada. The film is called Dark Lullabies, and it was made by a filmmaker, a woman who is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And as she grew up, she wanted to know, what about the children of the perpetrators? How do they grow up? How do they live? What kind of relationships can they form? Or are they person like you just mentioned a moment ago, who don't want to remember? Or can they not help remembering all the time? And in that film, there is a conversation between the Canadian filmmaker, Irene Lilienheim Angelico, and a German filmmaker, whom she came to know on a professional basis. But when this German chap, heard about her plan that she wanted to go and meet children of perpetrators in Germany, he said, I'd be very interested to help you and work with you. So she invited him to get the entire logistics for her trip to Germany, whom she would meet, where they would meet, how long they would meet, etc., etc. But very early in the film, there is this conversation, and this is for me a crucial, important conversation. She says to him, Harold, what is in you of those who taught you your values? And immediately I begin to think, to look at the values that I inherited from my parents, particularly from my father. What are they? Am I likely to be an anti-Semite? Am I going to be a racist? Or am I going to be a resistor? These questions come up. And later in that conversation, he says to her, and again, this is an important section for me, he says to her, Irene, I envy you because you can have a positive relationship to your forebears. Although many of them aren't with you anymore, many of them were murdered, but you can relate to them in a positive way. You can keep them and hold them in memory, and hold them in memory fondly. He says, this for me is, then he says, for me as a German, that is not possible. I cannot relate myself to my forebears in a manner that I would want to honor them. And he says, only when I have completely broken with my father and anyone else who was an accomplice. Only when I've completely broken with them, then can I be free to do the things that I want to do. Which I now want to retranslate into a shorter phrase is, I cannot honor my father and mother. And hence for me, is this a possibility for me to do that? Or is it an impossible possibility? This is what I want to explore.
And following through on what you just said, you at one point in the essay introduce the Hebrew word zakhor. You tell us what that means and how it connects with what you're talking about in the essay.
The word zakhor means remember, or you can expand it. I mean, literally, it means remember, or as another subtext, do not forget. Because if you do not remember, so particularly Elie Wiesel would make that point, and other Jewish survivors, if you do not remember, you give Hitler a posthumous victory. Because what Hitler wanted to do was to eradicate and erase all Jewish presence, including erase the Jewish religion. And if we don't remember, then he gets to be the winner. And he said, that is an atrocity, to concede him victory. And so we must remember. And in remembering, there lies the dimension of honoring father and mother. It has been very helpful for me to understand what honoring father and mother means in the context of children and of survivors. And immediately the first generation, the second, and now the third generation of survivors' children. That honoring father and mother means you keep them awake in memory so that they do not become forgotten, that they do not disappear. And therefore, Hitler, once again, to say this, makes this point, gets the victory. And so as a German, I don't want to be part of an accomplice. I am the son of one perpetrator, but I do not want to have to choose between whether I would honor my father or whether I would honor the memory of those who perished. So that eventually I think I come out and saying, yes, I will obey this commandment, honor my father and mother, but I will honor them in preventing me and others from doing what they did. And that's why I have this funny dimension of, it is a possible impossibility, or is it an impossible possibility? I think it is possible, but it is possible only under certain conditions.
There's a quote, a number of quotes that really struck me, but one in particular that I wanted to be sure to talk with you about. At one point you write, how is it possible to claim that one believes in God and at the same time be part of a corporation, a nation, a people who did not shrink from planning and implementing a system of murder? That's quite the indictment. Tell us about that.
I'm very conscious of that. But again, I think the faith of the children of Abraham, the faith of Jews, is helpful here. Because in their judgment and in my judgment, it is possible to claim that one believes in God and then in the morning go out again and do what you're doing. The only possibility for that kind of God to exist is an idol. It is a non-God. And so to claim that I'm following the God of the Bible while I'm in my SS job and doing all these experiments, etc., is blasphemy, is idolatry, and it is not worship of the living God. I think for me, this argument is absolutely clear that it requires the creation of an idol to say, I believe in God and I'm doing this. I might even want to turn around and ask someone, if you really truly are a believer, if you follow the commandments, how then do you live with the way you have to live when you have to make compromises, when you have to make decisions that are dangerous for other people? Ask yourself, what kind of a God do I have to have in order to do what I need to do? So I think the indictment, I think you call it a rather serious one. And I think we have to wrestle with the fact that so much of our worship of God is a worship of a God whom we have fabricated so that we may be able to do the things that we want to do in order to achieve certain ends, such as the eradication of Jews.
Well, and actually, I didn't choose to use that term in any even remotely derogatory way. I chose it because I feel like it's a strong term to go along with a very strong quote. And I agree with you in terms of now I don't know how much you want to, if at all, talk about other societies within the context of this particular interview, but I couldn't help but think of some things that have happened here in the United States, and there were some people from a few different denominations who spoke out and even committed acts of civil disobedience in order to try to stop what was happening, whether it was related to the continued refusal of the government and industries to believe or say that they believed and do something about anthropogenic climate change, or a number of the things that happened in any number of invasions and occupations by the U.S. Of various countries since World War II. I feel as though that exact same quote could be applied to those situations.
I agree with you, Tom. And um, let me just say, without going into any specific examples, I'm not a citizen of the United States, but I'm a resident here. And when I watch the news and when I hear the reports of what is going on in this country, I'm overcome by a deep, deep, deep sadness of what I see happening here, and am alarmed that for many of the people that describe these or that do these acts, let me just use January the 6th as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Among the people were those who believe in God, and in many ways they may even have felt that they were empowered to do what they were doing by the God in whom they believe. I feel sorry, and I'm very, very sad that it is possible, that it was possible in Germany, that it is possible now in this country, but in many other countries, to keep saying we believe in the God of the Bible, and yet we do the things we do. Whether that be from this deeply embedded racism that is so alive in many places of the world, including this country, or let's go into another discussion, other dimension. Otherwise, I'm just going to choke.
Okay, all right. There's another quote that I plucked out of the essay, which kind of goes along with the one that I just read. Only a few perceived that the gospel to which they gave allegiance demanded a more radical opposition to the dominant powers of the time that they thought, than they thought. I'm sorry, powers then of the time than they thought. Um, Again, alluding to people of faith or proclaimed faith, and um, and yet not really putting up a what we would rightly call a radical opposition. Uh, and I'm sure, just to refer back for a second to the conversation that we just had, I'm certainly not arguing that Germany during the World War II era or the USA post World War II are the only countries that have ever, or have religious or people of faith who haven't done this, who haven't, lived up to that sort of radical opposition. I think it's been present off and on throughout history in all kinds of cultures. But what,
Yeah.
when we think about this, in some ways, as a theologian, if someone asked you after reading quotes like this, if somebody said, "So what do you do? What do you think we should do to try to change this so that people do react, or more people do react in a way um, that opposes the dominant powers and some of the morally depraved things that they do?"
I'll give you a two-part answer, Tom, for this. I'm talking about the first part, and if I, in the second part, forgotten, please remind me again. Yeah.
Okay.
I had an experience here in Dover a couple of years ago. I had been invited by the local synagogue here in Dover, which is unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. I had been invited to be part of the Friday evening worship. And the rabbi invited me to speak to the congregation during worship. Just for a moment, think, what rabbi would invite a German child of a perpetrator to come and preach at a synagogue service? Well, to me, this was a gift, an unbelievable gift. After the service was over, there was a time for questions, and one gentleman in the congregation asked, "Well, if you were standing in front of President Trump, what would you say to him?" That question came out of the blue for me. I wasn't ready for it. But after thinking for a moment, I said, the very first person that I would speak to is myself. And that is what I would have to say to myself. Martin, in the presence of you is one of God's creatures, a child of God. You cannot, you must not, you dare not despise another creature of God, another child of God. So keep in mind that whatever you might be saying that would separate you from that person, in the sense that you would push him out of your vision, or that you say, I'm not, that man isn't worthy of my talking to him. I've already given him the victory. Namely, I have demonstrated to myself as a failing Christian, or the failing follower of the God of the Bible. Now, to the second part of the question is, we need to understand that what is really meant when we talk about honoring our parents. I don't think it means we need to do everything that they did, or we need to become what they wish us to become. Our freedom ought not to be determined, our freedom to be who we are ought not to be determined by one's parents' wishes. I have, in many instances, come across people who are saying, we did these things, these atrocious things, because our parents gave us permission to do this. I want to go in the other direction when I talk about resistance. The resistance has to include resistance against one's parents, of saying, I cannot go with you on this path. I will not go with you on this path. In fact, I will have to oppose you on this path. But my opposition is such that at no point will I break the relationship to you, because you gave me life, you gave me existence, you brought me up, etc., etc. I owe you something, but I also must believe, I must adhere to the other commandment, namely, I am the God of your fathers and mothers who brought you out of Egypt. You are to love me with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind. And so I have to hold in balance the love that is given to me as a commandment to honor my parents, the love that is given to me in honoring God, and I must obey God more than my parents, to use an old adage, a phrase. So I think resistance can be a very positive choice, also in relationship to one's forebears. At the same time, as one always has to try not just simply to write them off. So I can't go back to this conversation that Irene Lilienheim had with a German filmmaker. I cannot say, only when I'm totally rid of my father will I be able to be free to do what I want. That is a freedom at enormously high price, and eventually it will fail. In my judgment, that is.
Also in the essay, you refer to your parents, I guess particularly your father, but your maybe your family in general, or some of them, as complicit with the Nazis. And for those who maybe haven't heard the prior interviews that we've done together, tell us why you choose that word for your family.
In this long engagement that I have with this issue of being a child of a perpetrator, I've talked to a good number of people, and particularly in the beginning, there were several very distinguished rabbis in Toronto and then later on here in the United States who were saying, don't involve yourself in the question of whether you are guilty or not. You are not guilty because you didn't do any of the deeds. You might want to talk about your parents being guilty. That's one thing. But for you, you mustn't talk about being guilty. And then I described to them what my father did. My father did not work in the concentration camps. In fact, most of the time of World War II, he was in Paris, in occupied France. And his job was to steer the chemical industry in France and in 2 other countries in favor of the German war efforts. So he had a job to run a factory that was useful for the conduct of the war. I have no indications ever that my father ever said to anyone that person has to be killed or these people have to be eliminated. So he is not responsible directly for the execution and murder of people. But he worked for a company, and all his life, in fact, from the day my father had his first job to the day he died, he was with that company. They paid his salary, they paid his income, his pension, etc., etc. That company built Auschwitz concentration camp and the huge factory for the production of material for Hitler's war. And what the company did, that was the decision that it made, was when we have so many working people available through the extermination camp, Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, when we have so many workers available, we can reduce their food input so that they're alive and can work for maybe 3 weeks and then they're going to drop dead, and we just have so many others to replace them. In other words, a decision was made by the executive of my father's company that they were going to participate in the extermination of Jews through labor. And I once asked my father about that. And he said, no, he had nothing to do with it. He even said to me that he had never been to Auschwitz, even though I know that now that was a lie. Complicity means even half-hearted decision and agreement. Yes, we carry out this program of extermination through labor because we have a certain job to achieve. And when I spoke to my father about the director of the Auschwitz factory, whom I knew and whose family I knew, they knew our family. When I asked him whether he'd ever seen this man during the war in Auschwitz, he said, no, I have not. Now I have in my father's own handwriting the days when he was in Auschwitz. So why does my father deny all this? And I'm convinced about this. My father denies all this because he knows he was complicit. He did not resist the decision that we can eliminate human beings through hard labor. That was an official policy by his company. And that's why I'm talking about complicity. Sometimes I refer to myself as a child of a perpetrator. I may want to go a little easier on the word perpetrator and say much more that my father was an accomplice. He was not a bystander. Yeah.
Yeah. Another quote from the essay, in the Third Reich, Germans knew as much or as little as they wanted to know. What they did not know, they did not want to know. So there's, and I think this is one quote where there may be a few more not only scholars, but as somebody who has been active in a number of different war and peace and social justice issues for many years now, I've heard other people say similar things. People who aren't German and are not even from that generation, but in reference to Germany, and that the things that Hitler and his regime did were all legal because they created laws to make them legal.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that many in Germany just chose to know as little as possible. Talk about that. That has to be, in a way, kind of an excruciating thing to live with, no matter what one's reaction was at the time, to look back and feel as though an entire or much of an entire society had responded in this way to an atrocity.
Let me go back to that quotation that you read, and there's a third sentence in there. Mm-hmm. And that final third sentence is that Germans also knew enough to know that they did not want to know anymore. Mm. It was this statement during the Third Reich, the Germans knew as much or as little, etc., etc. That was a sentence that I mentioned to my father. And my father's reaction was really violent, not physically violent, to the point where he then said, one more thing like that, and our relationship is finished. For me, that was an indication that he had known enough to know that he didn't want to know anymore. I think there was really a determined attempt and an effort made after the war by Germans. Now we need to rebuild our country. Now we need to rebuild our houses. We need to rebuild our lives. Let's leave what is behind us. Let's leave it behind us so that we can become people again that have some self-respect. And I was part of that part of that attempt. I congratulate or I thank my parents that they made educational possibilities available to us and my family so that we could proceed in life and achieve certain levels of professionalism, of labor. In my family, with the exception of the oldest brother who died too young at the end of World War II, but all of us, the other 5 others of us, went to university and have been able to build up our lives in a good way. And we thank our parents for that. But the foundation of them doing this was a foundation of saying, let's leave other stuff behind. Let's make them not happening, so to speak. And to me, this is again where I raise the question of what kind of a God do you believe in when your decision is certain things of my life I'm just going to leave behind. I will not confess them. I will not confront them. I will push them out of the way. Let me give you another example. Again, this is one of the most painful ones. When we had moved to Canada and I was involved at McGill University, all my degrees are from McGill University, 4 of them. And in my last phase in my doctoral studies, I dated a fellow student, a woman at McGill, and I wanted to introduce her to my parents, and particularly for a New Year's Eve celebration. We had wonderful family parties. And I wanted Sally to be part of my family having this lovely New Year's Eve gathering. So I mentioned to my parents that I had this friend, and my mother asked whether my friend, what church did she attend? And I said to my parents, Mutti, Sally does not attend church, she attends synagogue. And for a moment there was deadly silence. And then my father said, you are not bringing a Jewish woman into our house, are you? I've been burdened with that statement. And in a conversation I had with Rabbi Richard Rubenstein, a very influential person for me in my life, I told him that, and I said I couldn't believe that so many years after World War II, there was still that much anti-Semitism in my house, in my father. And he said, Martin, have you ever considered the following? Your father probably was well enough educated to know that a Jew is determined by who the mother was. And do you think your father had realized that if you and Sally were going to get together and have children, that his grandchildren would be Jewish? To me, this is a very helpful insight. And I believe that is the reason why my father said what he did. But now, of course, it is just more behind it. Yeah? What's wrong with having Jewish grandchildren? Yeah. And I think this is where the long and burdensome tradition of anti-Judaism that is in with Christianity, and which then helped buttress so much of anti-Semitism, it still does it to this day, that was showing again. That father was saying no relationships with Jews. That is, again, one of the things where, when I think of the commandment to honor my parents, how can I do that if this is the way they talk about Jewish people? Yeah.
There are, of course, a lot of people in any, I would argue, any culture that we might mention, who, especially when it comes to um, family relations, who would opt for conflict avoidance, and so many do. Don't make waves, and you can't change what happened, and all those kind of things that kind of support the notion of just letting it be, or conflict avoidance. What was it that you feel compelled you to want to continue to have these discussions with your family members?
It's very interesting that in relationship to my family members, I'm the third of my parents' children. There were 8 pregnancies. 2 of them were stillborn, and the oldest brother was killed in World War II. That left 5 of us, and of those 5, I'm the second oldest. My older brother completely rejected my understanding of my parents or my father having been an accomplice, a perpetrator. He rejected that, and he took me to task for it. So I couldn't discuss these things with him. Then I'm the second one, and then 2 daughters, 2 sisters, and then one more boy, a son. The older of the 2 sisters, she was born in 1940, so by the time we came to Canada, she was 12, and much of her upbringing and growing up was in Canada, in contact with Jews too, so that Heidi had made acquaintances with people and was interested in knowing how they reacted to Germans, to us as their friends. So she was more open. The second daughter completely refused to accept any of my conclusions in relation to father. It is now the youngest of my brothers. He was 4 years when we came to Canada in 52. And he is completely open. And he, in fact, said to me some time ago that if I ever were to go back to Auschwitz, he says he wants to come along. So he is wrestling with something that is very much of what I'm wrestling with. And the recognition that I have from my brother Carl, and the way I want to say it the way he did, is when we do push it back, it will have enough time to reconfigure itself and then show up again. And when I heard him saying that, I was thinking of Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us. This is now this new, like in the coronavirus, it has a new variation. The new variation of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism is coming through. And that is because these people have grown up surrounded by those who pushed everything in the background. Let's leave it behind. Let's deal with what is before us. And that is where I think the work that we have to do, who do remember what happened, that this does not happen again. I can't say I'm very optimistic. When I saw the marches in Charlottesville, that the hatred of Jews, that the people who shouted all these things didn't cover their faces anymore. They showed their faces, and they came with torches, like they did in 1933 in Berlin. Yeah, and that it is so easy and so normal that you show your anti-Semitic face in public has me deeply worried. And hence the labor of teaching the Holocaust and of exploring all the facets, and above all, how it can reshape itself, is so important.
And that I agree with the analogy of the spread of that type of hatred being like a virus. I personally think it is. It's a virus of the mind, and it really has infected uh, a number of people. I suppose in some ways it always has, but certainly we've seen a flare up of it here in this country over the last few years. There's another phrase that jumped out at me mainly because I had not heard it before. You know, I had heard some of the quotes, you know, from Hitler about making Germany great again, and I understood, you know, what was behind that with the whole aftermath of World War I and so on. But in your essay, you mentioned your brother who went off and fought for Hitler and was killed. And the way you phrased it was he went off to defend Hitler and the promise of eternal Germany. And I was kind of struck by that phrase, eternal Germany, and wondered about, you know, I presume it was the German equivalent of that word eternal that may have been attached to it. But what exactly was meant by that, the eternal part of that phrase?
I use that phrase because I'm aware, or was aware of a whole series of books published in a series called Ewiges Deutschland, Eternal Germany.
Hmm.
And it was, they gathered everything that could be said that was positive about the German character. Not that the individual German would be eternal, but that the Germany that had these particular orientations, these particular convictions, these virtues, these strengths, would create that 1,000-year Reich and beyond. It was a statement of faith. I'm quite happy quite willing to call it. It was a statement of faith in the ability of this Germany to become the promised land, the beacon on the hill, the model for the whole world, for the super race to be there and to run the show. I think the word eternal is not to be overstressed or overemphasized, but it was clear in the minds of these people that if this was the kind of Germany that we would build, it would last. It would be around, and not only would it be an eternal Germany, but it would be an eternal world living by the values of the 1,000-year Reich. I have often wondered, since coming to North America, I've lived in the United States now regularly since 2010. And I've often asked myself, what do you find in this country that is to be praised, to be treasured, to be valued? And when I think about this, I've often come across, or what comes to my mind is, what would you call the greatest contribution of the United States of America to world civilization? And I now have been saying this quite regularly. The greatest contribution, as I see it, of the United States is that it provided a safe living space for Judaism and Jews to thrive. I say this because it was the intention of Hitler and many others to eliminate the Jewish people, to reduce them and make them as weak as possible, to eliminate their worship, to eliminate their God. And the United States said no. We will not participate in this program. In fact, we will create the space for them to be safe. Now, it sputtered, yeah. In Canada, they said none is too many. In this country, they said, well, 6 million died, etc., etc. I don't want to go into this, but I do want to say that if it had not been for the United States, the recovery and the flourishing and the expansion and broadening of Jewish life could not have happened. So I'm grateful that I can be in this country, on this continent, and be in touch with Jewish people and rejoice in their survival and worry with them about the threats against them. And that to me is an enormously encouraging factor to keep going the way I keep on keeping on in relationship to the German past, to the past of my own family, and above all to the past of the church's anti-Judaism, which alas is still alive and well.
Yeah. So I've been talking with theologian Martin Rumscheidt. Martin, thank you so much for your time. As always, it's a great pleasure to read your writing and to talk with you about these various things.
Thank you for providing a chance for me to have this kind of conversation. And you are a good interviewer, Tom. So I'm hoping we can keep this going. Thank you.
I hope so too, and I think that we will. So thank you.